Okie dokie, I'm just going to chat you through the basics of what you should be doing for your English Literature Paper 2 tomorrow. This will only work for you if you're studying AQA. So if you're not doing AQA, it's not the right one for you, all right? So just make sure you got that in the first place. The exam tomorrow is a long one. I think it must be the longest GCSE actually. So it's 2 hours and a quarter, and it comes in 3 sections. So you've got section A, section B, and section C. So each section, you need to spend about 45 minutes on each section. That's split up perfectly because it's 45 minutes on the first bit, then 45 minutes on the second bit, and then 45 minutes on section C, and that altogether makes 2 hours and a quarter. But that means that you have to do your planning and your proofreading and your writing and everything all in that 45 minutes. So you're quite pressured for time. It's a long exam, but it's not one where you're going to have time banging about. So I just wanted to chat to you a little bit about the strategy that you should be taking in each of the questions. So the first question is going to be for the vast majority of people and in spectacles. And what's important is the first thing is that you get 2 questions. Do not answer them both. Only answer one question and you get to choose from whatever it will be. So it might be, so for example, how does Priestley present Eric as a character who takes responsibility, and then you might talk about him. Or it might be, you know, how does Priestley present Eric as a moral character, and then you'd have to do your essay about that. But you'd also then have a choice with something else that is likely to be more theme focused. So how does Priestley present gender, or how does he present gender inequality, for example? So you pick which one you want to do. You don't answer them both. And what I would say about this is it's important that you have to write about the whole play. And so one of the things that I teach my students to do, and I think this works really well, is that when you do your essay plan, try and think of something that proves your point, whatever your point is, your premise. That take something from the beginning, write a paragraph about that, something from the middle, another thing from around the middle. And when I say the middle, I can mean anywhere between not the beginning and not the end. And then again, something from the end. So you need to start with your premise. So when you're doing your plan, the first thing that you need to do is write what your premise would be. And your premise is essentially like your hypothesis or your argument. And for those people who want to get a grade 6 or above, really, you must have a premise. That is basically your thing that you're going to argue throughout, because that allows you to make a developed essay, because you keep arguing the same point throughout. So for example, I might say that, I don't know, gender, if that was a question, gender in Inspector Calls, the reason that it's important is because, one, he shows the inequality and the poor experiences that women had to endure, but also that he begins to defy what expectations of gender are, in the fact that Sheila becomes quite powerful towards the end and quite outspoken. And I wouldn't go into all the details about Sheila or Mrs. Burning or Eva to begin with, but all I would do is answer the questions. So it would say, how does he present gender? And I would say, Priestley challenges the stereotypes of gender by presenting women in quite a different way from what would be expected in Edwardian society. And he also presents the fact that women, particularly, were treated quite poorly by men and were often taken advantage by men, especially if they were lower class. And that would be my premise. Then what I would do is I'd pick an event from the beginning, 2 from the middle, so 1 for each paragraph, and then 1 from the end that clearly demonstrate that. And each time in my AO1 comments, that's what happens and why, I would explain how what I've done, how what I've selected supports my premise. So as long as you can make a clear argument throughout your essay, you should do rather well. What's important as well with your Inspector Calls or whatever book it is you're doing for this bit, although predominantly it'll be Inspector Calls for people, is that you absolutely must include AO2 and AO3. So the AO1 is essentially what happens and why it happens and what you think about it. So kind of like who, what, where, when, why kind of thing. And obviously quotations. If you can embed your mini quotes, so lots of like little mini quotes. So for example, Mrs. Burling is a cold character because that's an embedded quotation, and she is quite rude, and she often tells her husband off when interrupting him and saying things like Arthur. All of those kind of ways of quoting where you embed little quotes are the best way to do it, and you're going to get you kind of level 4, 5, and 6 for your quotations. All of that's AO1. So what happens, why it happens, when it happens, what you think about it. and then quotations to support it. If you can't remember a quotation, you don't need to worry. You can just do a reference to the text. And then the next thing you need to remember is your AO2 and AO3. Now, oddly, although it's AO1, AO2, AO3, what I would argue is that your AO3 fits most nicely in with your AO1. So if you make a comment about gender, so for example, Sheila at the beginning is quite controlled by her family. She doesn't even know when she should drink independently, and she is told off by her father and asked to listen, and she just does what she says, even though she's in her early 20s. It's quite easy to support that with a comment about the fact that actually, at the time, women were often expected to be subservient to their husband, and it's not surprised that she buys into the institution of marriage that would have made her forever subservient to her husband, because that was traditional at Edwardian times. So it's quite easy to pop in a little bit of AO3 to aid your understanding without you needing to go on and on about it. Don't write lines and lines about AO3, just a quick reference here and there to help show your understanding of the characters. Why are they like the way they are? Well, Gerald is used to being in control because he's upper class. And at the time, upper class people had significant power in society and were very influential. So he's used to getting his own way and not being challenged. It's those kind of things. And then you must remember AO2. Now, lots of people might be doing language analysis for AO2, and that's like picking out individual words and saying what they imply. And that is absolutely fine. But what I would say is that the methods for a player are a bit wider than that. And so you want to be thinking about things like stage directions, props, dramatic irony with the Titanic thing and the, no one wants war. The juxtaposing of the characters or contrast from beginning to end, any kind of symbolism or theme or motif, so things that are repeated. It's a bit of a motif almost that Eva's pretty. Every single character describes her as pretty, apart from I think Mrs. Sperling. And that's important because what does that say about how women were viewed at the time? They were viewed through the lens of essentially what is the male gaze. So they were viewed according to whether or not they were pretty or not. Those are the kind of things you need to do. So just to quickly recap, I would expect you to do a premise, that's your argument, your answer to the question, what Priestley presents it as and why. And then something from the beginning, something from the middle, something from the middle, something from the end. And in each one of those, you need clear AO1 comments, what happens and what you think about that and how that supports your argument. And then maybe link it in with some AO3 if you can think of something. You'll need to do that a couple of times. And then go into some kind of how does he do that. So it's what's important is that AO2 is about the how, and you must remember to use the subject terminology. So use language devices if you have any, like hyperbole or whatever you think is in there, and anything like I don't know, stage directions, etc. Okay, so the final thing that I would say is that if you can, at the end, you want to try and say something clever at the end of your essay, because that way it makes it seem like when you're marking it as an examiner, so like all the way through, you're thinking, oh, is this a level 3 or level 4 kid? And then at the end they say something really smart, you think, oh, okay, yeah, they might tip over into level 4. So if you pop something quite clever in at the end, that can help. Sometimes talking about symbolism and what Priestley's social message is might help, or you can talk about nomenclature. I mentioned nomenclature in my previous video. That's essentially what the naming of things, and so what those names mean. So a really good example is that Sheila, for example, comes from in terms of etymology, comes from the word blind, because it was a person who was famously blind. That's where the name comes from. Now, that's important when you interpret Sheila's character, of course, because she was utterly blind to society because she was a cosseted woman, and then by the end she can see, metaphorically. So some of the names are quite interesting there. Moving on to poetry, so that your 45 minutes is up. Whatever you do, don't do 45 minutes and then just carry on. You don't want to do that. You want to move straight on. So when your 45 minutes is done, even if you haven't finished your essay, the statistics say that usually it's the first 10 minutes that you make the most marks in a question. So it's really worth making sure you don't get it wrong. Move on. With your poetry, you need to pick 2 poems to compare. One of them you'll be named, so you don't get to choose it, I guess. And then the second one you get to pick. And they will give you 1 question. You don't get a choice. I'm running out of battery, which means I have to move. Sorry about that. I should have thought about that in advance. Oh, hello. Right, it's plugged in. So yeah, power and conflict poetry. You'll need to pick a poem and then obviously compare it. If you don't compare it, you're going to really struggle to get a grade 5 or above. So even if you do brief comparisons, that works. And what I would say to you is that there are a few free things that you can do that are quite easy. So if you're struggling of things to say, try and look at the structure of the poem, how it looks on the page, and try and say something about that. You equally could use the title for the vast majority of poems. The title is actually something quite rich that you could analyse. Exposure being a good example of that, or remains. But that's true of the vast majority of them. I think the important thing is that you respond to the poetry in a similar way to that you would respond to the an inspector calls one. So I would like a premise at the beginning. That's your argument. So you answer the question, but instead of just about one text, answer it about both texts. So you might say, in both texts they present war or conflict as, or in both texts they do whatever it is. Or you might say, in one text they do this, whereas in the other text they do that. And then you should write about something from the poems that you can compare. Now, that doesn't have to be similar. You could say it's different. That's absolutely fine. And there are a few ways of approaching this question. Some people like to write an AO1 comparison, so what happens in the poem and what they're saying, and then again back and forth. So like in one poem, I don't know, they present war as a futile waste of effort, and that actually people aren't even fighting, they're just dying in the cold, so that would be exposure. Whereas in Remains or in Bayonet Charge or whatever, they focus specifically on the action of war, but again seem to have a negative view of it. So that's the kind of premise that you could have. And the kind of AO1 focus you might have. So you would just do a comparison. If you don't do AO1, if you don't do AO2, again, you're going to lose lots of marks. So you need to be able to pick out subject terminology. So that would be, for poetry, things like sibilants or similes or metaphors, personification, hyperbole, the punctuation, how the stanzas are laid out on the page. So in My Last Duchess, it's really long, great big monologue with no breaks in it. And you could argue that that was because he thinks so much of himself that he just continues to speak all of the time, that kind of thing. So I would do a clear premise where you compare. You have to compare. So write about them together. Don't write about them separately, together. And then you could do an AO1 comparison and then an AO2 comparison. But equally, you could do an AO1 comparison with AO2 in it. But AO2 absolutely has to have subject terminology, and you have to do what the effect of that particular device is. So don't say, oh, they use a metaphor, and then not talk about the effect, because that won't get you good marks. And a really good way to make sure you stay on AO2 is to talk about the structure and talk about the title, because both of those are clear choices made by the writer, and then you talk about the effect of them. And then you can do a brief conclusion if you've got anything clever you need to say. But it is important, again, that you include AO3. Now, AO3, again, doesn't have to be like really long, extra like paragraph about AO3. That's not what they want. What they want you to say is things like, I don't know, if you're talking about the prelude, talk about the fact that he was a pantheist and that he believed that God was showed his power and showed his presence through nature. That's enough. And that's why, of course, the Black Peak, huge and black and huge, it is important, because you could argue that it was God through nature kind of teaching him that his sin is wrong. That's your anthology, and again, 45 minutes and then you're done. 4 paragraphs is perfectly sufficient with your premise, and then like 3 other paragraphs is really fine. Then you get onto the unseen poetry. Kind of the same kind of thing, except that there are 2 questions, and I just want to briefly talk to you about those 2 questions because they're quite different what they want you to do. The first one, you just write about the unseen poem. It will ask you a question, do a little premise, and then try and make paragraphs, maybe one from the beginning, one from the middle, one from the end, or one that talks about the structure, maybe a couple that talk about either quotations or the title. And try to support whatever you've said in answer to the question. So if you say, like, I don't know, they quite often do things like a poem about nature or a poem about an animal or whatever, and they'd be like, well, I think the fox is presented really mischievously and he seems like he's sneaking around a lot, then make sure your quotes or whatever you pick out from the structure supports that. But again, you need subject terminology. Now, don't spend loads of time worrying about subject terminology, but you need to use it at least once or twice. And I spoke to my group earlier about, prefacing subject terminology. So you might, instead of saying the verb, you might say the aggressive verb, so that you explain that the type of sorry, I'm just getting messages. The type of subject terminology that is being used. So yeah, the name of it, like verb or noun or simile or whatever, but you also can describe it with an adjective. Would be great. Just a quick thing about the last question, which is the 8 marker. Lots of kids don't get any marks on this, and it's because they do AO2. Oh, they do AO1, not AO2. So AO2, sorry, someone just asked me a question about Edexcel. I don't know whether you have to use AO3, but I presume that you do, because that's the case in almost all specs. I'll be really surprised if you don't need to use AO3 in Edexcel Christmas Carol, but I'll tweet about it later and someone I'm sure will reply. Sorry, that's a totally off topic, but I can see someone's worried. So with that last question, what is important is what's important is that you only talk about AO2. So my advice to you would be either pick out individual words and give their connotations and then compare their connotations. So one is more happy or one's less enthusiastic or whatever. Or, because you're probably going to spend only 10 minutes on this. You only spend 35 minutes on your first unseen poem and then like 10 minutes on the last one. That comparison, I would recommend maybe looking at structure. So it's definitely AO2 if you're talking about structure, which is why you're not going to then sort of fall foul of the AO2 rule and start talking about AO1 and what it's about, because they don't want you to write what it's about. They want you to talk about how the writer does it. So it would make sense for you to talk about structure there, because that is definitely how the writer shows it. So you might say it's really broken up, and that it's symbolic of, I don't know, raindrops or whatever it is that the poem's about. Equally, you might say it's really long, and that's symbolic of. And often I feel like when you're talking about structure, it feels like you're kind of making it up and it feels a bit like nonsense. But if you can justify what you're saying with structure, that's okay. So you might say, there's lots of full stops at the end and it makes it sound abrupt, and they've done this to show it's symbolic of. Right, people are asking me for predictions. I don't know what's going to come up, but what I would say is that in Inspector Calls, last year's paper was Mrs. Burling as an unlikable character, so it's very unlikely that she'll come up. She might, but it is very unlikely because she came up last year. And how the inspector wants to make society better or something like that was last year's. I think that in the latest Sam's paper, which is Sam's 3, Eva as Paul and Gerald and his relationship with women came up. So who hasn't come up? Mr. Burling and Eric. So they might come up, but equally, I don't know. The poem last year was the named poem for the Power and Conflict was Bayonet Charge. So it's unlikely again that would come up. I really can't remember the question. I think it was effects of conflict. So again, unlikely that's going to come up. I think the identity is likely to come up, but I really, really don't know. And please don't only revise identity on that, because I haven't read the exam paper. I won't see it until, in fact, 24 hours after you sit it. So if anyone's got any questions, please tweet me and I will do my very best to answer them. And I wish you all good luck tomorrow. Cheerio.